I'm David Mullen, cinematographer for The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. If you've been on the show since the pilot and now the show's over, fifth and final season, but one of the cool things about the final season, I thought, were the flash forwards through the decades into the future. And what was your reaction when you found out about them, and how did you go about creating different looks for them as well?
Well, we got outlines for each episode in advance and before the script showed up. So I started to see these flash forwards and a few flashbacks, which we've had in the past, but these flash forwards are kind of a new thing, and there were a lot of them. The first episode of the season was this flash forward to the 1980s when you meet Midge's grown-up daughter in a psychiatric session. And so I started to think about how we were going to differentiate these visually, and we couldn't do anything too stylized because they're still part of the timeline of the story. It couldn't be strange or too abstract. Plus, there were so many and so many eras, you'd run out of kind of approaches very quickly. But my general idea was to reduce the amount of diffusion so that as we got to the present day of the 2000s, things would get cleaner and sharper and look a little more just straightforward. So we switched up mostly the filtration. We normally shot the show with a certain amount of Hollywood black magic diffusion. And then when we got to these flash forwards, we'd play with other types of filters. So there was still a little bit of diffusion, but it was a different type. So we shot that psychiatric scene with a low-con filter, and we settled on a glimmer glass filter for most of the flash forwards. But by the final episode, when we got to the 2005, the latest, we pretty much went filterless. We just shot as clean as possible.
Yeah, it felt in every one of the flash forwards felt kind of like modern, but also kind of old-timey a little bit. So it's kind of like still like vestiges of like the 60s and 50s Maisel we're used to.
Yeah, it's tricky because the story time of the show, we've always had a kind of vibrant, energetic, colorful look to it. So it seems strange, but some of the flash forwards were actually less saturated than the 1960 era of the main timeline, because to go anywhere visually, the only place we could go is the opposite direction, which was towards less color. And the storyline, it made sense because scenes were sadder, or there were, Joel in prison in episode 5. There's a lot of reasons to pull back on the color, particularly the Lenny Bruce opening for the final episode.
Yeah, for sure. Well, you're nominated for the series finale, 4 Minutes. And I mean, the centerpiece of that episode is obviously Midge's segment when she hijacks the remaining 4 minutes on the Gordon Ford show and she does her set. And as she's doing her set, the lighting also changes to harken back to the Gaslight, because the Gordon Ford set is kind of pastel-y, like typical talk show lit. And then you get this like 360 kind of dim look like the Gaslight. So what were the logistics of creating that callback?
Well, that was an idea that Amy had. She asked me if we could make the room feel like the Gaslight, basically with lighting. And being a theatrical TV studio environment, obviously we could. The question in my mind was, is this dimmer cue meant to be there for reality, or is it just a kind of fantasy moment? Because the problem is that we always cover the stand-up with multiple cameras, and then we cover it with a single camera. And we had planned this big 360-degree move around her for that moment. But we were also covering everyone's reactions. We shot that same performance with multiple cameras. And so I never was 100% convinced that the editor might not change their minds and use other angles for that final monologue for that moment. And so I had to do that cue in every angle, like every reaction shot on Abe and Rose. I had to do it on Joel's reaction shot, on Gordon Ford's reaction shot, because otherwise it seemed odd to me if they did cut away, that you would go from this dark Gaslight-like lighting on her and then everyone's still in the bright studio lighting. That would be more jarring, I think. So I just decided to recreate that cue once we programmed it into the board. We more or less ran it on every time we got to that same moment. We ran it on wherever the camera was pointed. But luckily Amy was pretty set on doing it in a single shot. a 360-degree move. So, and that's what we committed to. We actually did it twice because when we did it, we spent a week shooting that final 4-minute sequence because it was so many. Unlike our normal style, that sequence had a lot of cuts. We had to do reaction shots on everyone throughout the whole sequence, and we didn't want to shoot like all of Abe's reaction shot on one day and do like 12 pages of off-screen dialogue and him reacting to that. So every day we would shoot the section of the script, and then we'd shoot everyone's reaction to that section of the script. So I had to go back and to the audience and keep recreating the lighting on Joel, on Archie, on Rose and Abe, because we would always go back every day to their reactions. So we did that 360-degree move, but we had a little bit of a technical glitch with our Steadicam. We had done a very fast Steadicam move in Midge's hallway in her apartment, running backwards, and we ran into a wall basically with the camera, and we caused a little bit of a jitter in somewhere in the post of the Steadicam, and we kept all week we were swapping out the arm, the head, every control piece on the Steadicam. We kept swapping out, trying to get rid of this tiny little shimmer, and we were, thinking, well, maybe we could get rid of it in post with a little stabilization. But so we did that 360-degree shot the first time. There was every now and then a tiny little jitter, and we were sitting there going like, well, maybe I can fix that in post. But it needed to be such a perfect shot. It couldn't have anything distracting in it. That Jim McConkey begged to do it again, our operator, and Rachel was more than happy to have another pass at it. She liked doing that.
Yeah, I mean, she nailed it. So
yeah,
well,
she nailed it over and over again, 2 days in a row, and she was brilliant. So she didn't mind doing it one more time, and we came back the next day and fixed everything on the Steadicam, and it was perfect. And I'd actually slightly improved the lighting too, because once I'd done it once the day before, I said, well, this light here should cue up one beat later, and this light shouldn't be on yet when we come around to it, because
you had some practice. So
yeah, I practiced it. I was trying to keep it constantly backlit, so because it's 360, it's constantly crossfading one light after another light after another light as we circled her. So it was fun to I basically lit it the week before, a few days before we shot it as a proof of concept and showed it to Amy. The other tricky thing is the Gaslight is always smoked and hazed, and the Gordon Ford set isn't. So that shooting day, I had to slowly add haze into the TV studio in order to have the effect once the lights switched over. And so you can see some haze building up that we tried to correct a little bit out in post. Although, ironically, because we reshot it again the next morning, I could have spent the whole day before not doing the haze. Although I would have had the same problem with the multiple cameras running on that one moment. So, but yeah, it was all Amy's idea to do that lighting cue. She just wanted the feeling of the Gaslight.
Yeah, I think fans appreciated it, because I think once the lights dim, like every fan just knew instantly it's a callback to the Gaslight, and they loved it. So, but there's another one or like 360 move in that whole scene when Midge first eyes the mic and she decides she's gonna take it. And then the camera goes around and the mic comes in focus at one point, and then the focus shifts back to Midge. So what was it like shooting that? And did you have that same issue with the recalcitrant Steadicam?
No, well, the problem with the Steadicam was very subtle, and it basically didn't show up on that particular shot. But it was very elaborately staged. It sort of starts where Midge gets called off her stool once they cut to commercial, and she goes over to her parents, and the camera follows her over to her parents. Then there's a little bit of coverage, but then the master on the Steadicam continues as she leaves her parents, sees the microphone and circles around her, then crosses over to get Susie and brings Susie over and lands into a 2-shot. And so that was all in Amy's blocking, and she wanted that moment all in one shot. And of course, as soon as we circled the mic, I asked her, do you want us to pull focus to the mic? That's a more obvious statement than if we didn't pull focus to the mic, but she liked the idea of pulling focus to the mic. And then it was a little tricky for Anthony, our focus puller, because on a Steadicam, there are no marks. So the Steadicam may be 6 inches from that mic, or it might be 8 inches from that mic on each take. And he would sort of see it come into frame and nail it. But so it was complicated lighting wise, that whole sequence, because that TV studio is lit like an old TV studio with a lot of tungsten Fresnel lights in the grid, because in case I ever saw them, I wanted to make sure they were period correct.
Right.
But because that sequence had normally the set is lit for a stand up at the mic and the desk area and the band area, but they were playing their scene on the stools in between the mic and the desk area, and then Midge was walking over to Mike Carr's station and back to by the band, and then crossing back to the stools. So I had to go with a softer light because I needed the actors just have more room to move in different positions. So I couldn't have a bunch of hard spotlights on 30 different positions. So I switched the key lights to these sky panels. So there was a little bit of a softer effect that had more spread. So they had more freedom to move, but I still needed to flag it off the curtains and stuff. So otherwise the room would get very flat looking. So my key grip, Charlie Sherrod, had to build a giant teaser for all the sky panels to keep them teased off the curtain and things like that. So it took some lighting for that final sequence, and then we were there for a week.
Yeah, well, it all looked incredible. Well, David, it was great speaking with you. Congratulations again on 5 seasons and your nomination again. We'll see you back here in a little bit.